The first time I noticed the spiders, I thought it was my imagination. They appeared in my peripheral vision, dark shapes scuttling across the wallpaper, disappearing the moment I turned my head. My daughter Rebecca assured me it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks. "It happens at your age, mother," she said with that patronizing smile I'd grown to despise. But I've been weaving webs of my own for 76 years, and I know predators when I see them. The spiders weren't in my head, they were in my house. Planted there by my own flesh and blood, part of an elaborate psychological campaign designed to make me question my sanity. What they didn't realize was that doubt had abandoned me long ago, replaced by the cold certainty that survival requires vigilance. My name is Vivian Ashcroft, and I am worth $43 million. More importantly, I am the only thing standing between my family and that fortune. They think my age makes me vulnerable. They're about to learn otherwise. It started 6 months ago when Rebecca moved back into the family estate with her husband David and their twin sons, Jake and Luke. "Just until we get back on our feet," she said, but I knew better. Rebecca's interior design business had failed spectacularly, and David's gambling debts were an open secret in our small Connecticut town. At first, their presence seemed harmless enough. The boys, 19 now, helped with yard work. David fixed a few loose shutters. Rebecca cooked elaborate meals that reminded me of holidays past. I almost allowed myself to believe they cared. Then came the gaslighting. It began subtly. Items moved from where I'd left them. The thermostat adjusted to uncomfortable temperatures. My morning newspaper disappearing before I could read it. When I mentioned these things, they exchanged those looks, the kind that said, "Poor old dear, losing her marbles." The spiders were their masterstroke. I discovered the truth by accident, padding to the kitchen at 3 a.m. for a glass of water. Through the window, I saw Luke in the garden shed, hunched over something small and dark. Curiosity overrode caution, and I crept outside. He was holding a jar full of wolf spiders, their legs thick and hairy, bodies pulsing with predatory intent. On the workbench beside him lay a dozen more jars, each containing the same 8-legged nightmares. "Perfect," he whispered to himself, screwing the lid back on. "Gran's going to lose her shit." I retreated to my room, mind racing. They weren't just trying to convince others I was senile, they were trying to convince me. Break down my confidence, make me doubt my own perceptions. Once they'd succeeded, it would be a small step to having me declared incompetent. But they'd made their first mistake. They'd revealed their hand too early. The next morning, I played along with beautiful precision. "Rebecca," I called from the drawing room, letting just the right note of hysteria creep into my voice. "There are spiders everywhere. They're crawling on me." She rushed in with David and the twins, all wearing expressions of practiced concern. I flailed at invisible arachnids, whimpering about creatures that weren't there, while the real spiders, the ones Luke had released, scurried along the baseboards just out of my sight line. "Mom, there's nothing there," Rebecca soothed, but I caught the gleam in her eyes. "David, call Dr. Peterson. I think we need to discuss Mom's episodes." Dr. Peterson arrived that afternoon, a soft-spoken man who'd been our family physician for 20 years. He examined me with gentle thoroughness, while my family hovered nearby, painting a picture of an elderly woman losing her grip on reality. "Hallucinations are common in patients with early-stage dementia," he murmured to Rebecca, just loud enough for me to overhear. "We should consider medication. And perhaps other arrangements." Other arrangements. A nursing home, most likely. Somewhere they could visit twice a year and pretend to grieve while they liquidated my assets. But while they whispered in the hallway, I was photographing the real spiders with my phone, documenting their strategic placement near electrical outlets and in dark corners. I'd learned technology out of necessity. Staying relevant in business required adaptation. Now it would help me stay alive. That night, I did my own hunting. Armed with a jar and a lifetime of patience, I collected 24 of Luke's planted spiders. The next morning, I distributed them throughout Rebecca's bedroom and bathroom, paying special attention to her jewelry box and the space under her pillow. Her screams at 6 a.m. were music to my ears. "Someone put spiders in my room," she shrieked, standing on her bed in her nightgown. "They're everywhere." I appeared in the doorway, the picture of confused innocence. Spiders, dear? But I thought you said they were all in my imagination. The look she gave me was pure venom, but she couldn't accuse me without admitting she knew about the original infestation. Her psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. Strike one to Grandma. Having failed to convince the world I was losing my mind, they decided to help me lose my life instead. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Our Victorian mansion featured a grand staircase with an ornate banister that had been loose for months. One little accident, a frail old woman taking a tumble down 18 wooden steps, and their problems would be solved. They didn't know I'd been monitoring their late-night meetings through the baby monitor I'd planted in the kitchen. Modern technology wasn't the only skill I'd acquired. Decades of corporate espionage had taught me the value of good intelligence. The banister's already wobbling. David's voice crackled through the speaker. All we need is a little encouragement. What if she survives the fall? That was Jake, always the worrier. At her age? Unlikely. And even if she does, broken hips in elderly patients often lead to complications. Pneumonia, blood clots. She'll die slowly in the hospital, Luke finished. And we'll be the grieving family, inheriting everything. The next morning, I noticed their handiwork immediately. The banister hadn't just been loosened, it had been sabotaged. The support brackets hung by threads, designed to give way the moment significant weight leaned against them. But they'd forgotten something crucial about their intended victim. Before I was a wealthy widow, I was an engineer. Before I inherited money, I built bridges. And before I became their target, I learned to spot structural weaknesses from a mile away. I spent the day preparing my counteroffensive. That evening, I made a show of heading upstairs with my usual handful of medications, gripping the banister dramatically as I climbed. From below, I heard Rebecca's sharp intake of breath, felt their collective attention focused on my every step. On the landing, I paused and called down, "Rebecca, dear, could you bring me my reading glasses?" I left them in the kitchen. "Of course, Mother." Her voice was strained with anticipation. As she climbed toward me, I stepped back into the shadows. The banister groaned under her weight. She'd put on considerable pounds since moving back home, and I saw the exact moment she realized the trap was meant for me. But it was too late. Her momentum carried her forward, and the sabotaged railing gave way with a splintering crash. She tumbled down those 18 steps with the same grace they'd planned for me, landing in a heap at the bottom. The irony was delicious, hoisted by her own petard, quite literally. David and the twins rushed to her aid, while I descended carefully using the opposite railing, which I'd tested thoroughly that afternoon. "Oh my goodness," I gasped, kneeling beside my groaning daughter. "Rebecca, are you hurt? How did this happen?" Her left arm was clearly broken, and I suspected a few ribs as well. As David called for an ambulance, she looked up at me with eyes full of pain and dawning realization. "You knew," she whispered. I leaned closer, speaking softly enough that only she could hear. "I've known since the spiders, darling. Did you really think I'd raised you for 37 years without learning to read your tells?" The paramedics arrived and whisked her away to the hospital. David went with her, leaving me alone with my grandsons. As their parents' car disappeared down the drive, Jake turned to me with barely concealed fury. "That should have been you falling down those stairs. Should it?" I smiled serenely. How careless of me to avoid my own accident. Strike two to Grandma. With Rebecca laid up in the hospital and their timeline accelerating, the boys decided to take matters into their own hands. They were young, impatient, and fatally overconfident in their abilities. The plan they hatched was surprisingly sophisticated for college dropouts. Natural gas leak in the middle of the night, I'd simply go to sleep and never wake up. Another tragic accident, this one impossible to trace back to them. I discovered their scheme the same way I'd uncovered the others, through careful observation and a healthy dose of paranoia. Jake had been researching gas line locations online using the family computer, forgetting that browser history tells a story. Luke had made multiple trips to the hardware store, purchasing tools they had no legitimate need for. But their fatal flaw was assuming I'd be helpless in the face of their plan. They made their move on a cold November night when the windows would naturally be closed and the heating system running at full capacity. I lay in bed, listening to the subtle sounds of amateur sabotage, the soft clink of tools, whispered curses when something didn't cooperate, the eventual hiss of escaping gas. The smell reached me within minutes, that distinctive rotten egg odor that meant death was seeping into my bedroom. In a normal scenario, I'd have been overcome within the hour, too drowsy to wake up as carbon monoxide replaced the oxygen in my bloodstream. Instead, I activated the plan I'd been preparing for weeks. The portable oxygen tank I'd hidden under my bed wasn't medical equipment, it was a scuba diving tank, complete with regulator and mask. As the natural gas flooded my room, I breathed pure oxygen and waited. Through my bedroom window, I could see the boys in the garden, watching for signs of fire or explosion. They didn't want me to burn, that would raise too many questions. They just wanted the gas to do its silent, invisible work. At 3 a.m., I heard them creeping back into the house to check their handiwork. They found my door locked, which was expected. I'd been locking it since Rebecca's accident. What they didn't expect was my voice, strong and clear, calling out from inside. "Boys? Is someone there?" The silence that followed was profound. "Grandmother." Luke's voice was uncertain. Are you all right?" "Fine, dear. Just couldn't sleep with all that racket you were making outside." I heard them retreating, whispering frantically. They'd have to turn off the gas before anyone else noticed the smell, which meant climbing back under the house to reverse their sabotage. While they scrambled to cover their tracks, I opened my windows and activated the house's ventilation system. By morning, the evidence of their attempt had been erased, except for the photographs I'd taken of the damaged gas line and the video I'd recorded of their midnight activities using the security cameras I'd had installed weeks earlier. When David returned from the hospital, he found me calmly eating breakfast while his son sat in sullen silence at the kitchen table. "How's Rebecca?" I asked pleasantly. "She'll recover," he said, studying my face for signs of what? Illness? Confusion? Death? Wonderful news. I was so worried about her accident. I smiled at Jake and Luke. And I'm grateful the boys were here to keep me company last night. Though I do hope they'll be more careful with their late-night projects in the future. The look of shock on their faces was priceless. Strike 3 to Grandma. Desperation makes people reckless, and my family was nothing if not desperate. With their subtle attempts foiled and Rebecca still bedridden, David decided on a more direct approach. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Kidnap me, force me to sign a new will naming them as beneficiaries, then dispose of the evidence, meaning me. They moved on a rainy Tuesday when the housekeeper was off and the groundskeeper had gone into town for supplies. David approached me in my study where I was supposedly reviewing investment portfolios, unaware that I was actually monitoring their activities through the comprehensive surveillance system I'd installed throughout the house. "Vivian," he said, his voice artificially calm, "we need to talk." I looked up from my papers, noting the way he positioned himself between me and the door. Behind him, Jake and Luke flanked the entrance like trained guard dogs. "Of course, David. What's on your mind?" "Your will. We think it's time for some updates." I set down my pen carefully. "Updates? You're not getting any younger, and with these recent episodes." He gestured vaguely, as if my imaginary mental decline was evident to anyone with eyes. "We want to make sure your affairs are in order." "How thoughtful of you." Luke stepped forward, producing a manila folder. "We've had our lawyer draft a new version. Much simpler than the current one. Everything goes to Rebecca, with provisions for the rest of us." Their lawyer. Of course they'd found some desperate attorney willing to participate in elder abuse for the right price. I accepted the folder and pretended to read through the documents, noting the deliberate complexity of the language and the convenient provisions that would allow them to liquidate my assets immediately upon my death. "This is quite comprehensive," I said finally, though I noticed there's no mention of my charitable foundations. "Charity begins at home," David replied, his mask slipping slightly. "Your family should come first." "You're absolutely right." I reached for my pen. Family should come first. But instead of signing, I pressed the silent alarm button hidden beneath my desk, a panic system connected directly to the local police station. Then I looked up at my would-be captors with a smile that could have frozen hellfire. "Which is why I'm so disappointed in mine." David's face darkened. Sign the will, Vivian. Or what? Or we'll make sure you have an accident that's much more permanent than Rebecca's fall. I nodded thoughtfully. So we're past pretending this is about my welfare. Jake produced a knife from his jacket, not a kitchen blade, but a hunting knife with a serrated edge designed for maximum damage. Sign it now, or we'll make you wish you had. I studied their faces, noting the desperation, the greed, the complete absence of human feeling. These weren't my family anymore, if they ever had been. They were predators who'd infiltrated my home and fed off my generosity until they were ready to devour me entirely. No, I said simply. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. What did you say? David's voice was deadly quiet. I said no. No. No, I will not sign your fraudulent will. No, I will not make it easy for you to steal my life's work. And no, I will not go quietly into whatever grave you've prepared for me. Luke lunged forward with the knife, but I was ready. The taser I'd concealed in my desk drawer delivered 50,000 volts directly to his nervous system. He collapsed, convulsing, the knife skittering across the hardwood floor. Jake roared and charged, but I'd been expecting that too. The pepper spray caught him full in the face, sending him to his knees, clawing at his eyes and gasping for breath. That left David, who stood frozen in shock at seeing his backup plan crumble in seconds. You see, I said conversationally, stepping over Luke's twitching form, you made the same mistake so many people make about the elderly. You assumed that age equals helplessness. That white hair means weak will. That a slow walk indicates a slow mind. The sound of sirens grew louder outside. But I didn't survive 7 decades in a man's world by being fragile. I didn't build a business empire by being naive. And I certainly didn't accumulate $43 million by being stupid. The front door burst open and police officers flooded into the house. I'd given them the security codes weeks ago, along with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, the recorded conversations, the photographs of sabotage, the video footage of their various attempts on my life. As they handcuffed my family, I continued my explanation. You see, gentlemen, the reason I survived every one of your little schemes is simple. I've been playing this game since before you were born. Corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, industrial sabotage, I've seen every dirty trick in the book. Compared to what I dealt with in the boardroom, your amateur hour dramatics were child's play. David struggled against his restraints. You can't prove anything. I laughed, a sound like breaking glass. David, I have video of you discussing my murder. I have audio recordings of you planning to forge my signature. I have forensic evidence of your attempts to poison me, trap me, and gas me to death. The only thing I can't prove is how you convinced my daughter to participate in trying to kill her own mother. As they led my family away, Detective Morrison, an old friend who'd investigated several of my business competitors over the years, shook his head in amazement. Vivian, how long have you known? Since the spiders, I replied. Everything after that was just building a case. The trial was a media sensation. Elderly heiress outsmarts murder plot ran as headlines for weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions damning, and the sentences severe. Rebecca, despite her claims of manipulation and coercion, received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder. Her broken bones had healed, but her broken soul was beyond repair. David got life without parole for orchestrating the entire scheme and for his final attempt at forced signature fraud, legally classified as kidnapping with intent to commit murder. Jake and Luke, despite their youth, were tried as adults due to the severity of their crimes. 15 years each for attempted murder, with additional charges for elder abuse and conspiracy. The courtroom was packed during my victim impact statement. I looked directly at each of them as I spoke. You tried to kill me because you thought I was weak. You thought my age made me vulnerable, my kindness made me stupid, and my love for you made me blind. You were wrong on all counts. I paused, letting the weight of their failure settle over them. I survived the Depression as a child, built a business in the 1960s when women weren't allowed in boardrooms, and outlasted competitors who would have eaten you alive before breakfast. Did you really think a few spiders and some loose screws would be enough to defeat me? The judge sentenced them each to the maximum allowed by law. As they were led away in chains, Rebecca looked back at me one last time. I saw no remorse in her eyes, only the bitter recognition that she'd underestimated her prey. I'm sitting in my study now, the same room where they made their final play. The house is quiet again, truly quiet this time, not the false peace that preceded their attacks. The surveillance system remains active, but now it guards against strangers rather than family. My new will is ironclad, drafted by attorneys who specialize in protecting elderly clients from predatory relatives. Most of my fortune will go to organizations that fight elder abuse, a fitting legacy for someone who survived it. But I'm not ready for legacies yet. At 76, I have years left in me, and I intend to use every one of them. I've started a consulting business helping other elderly victims recognize and combat financial abuse. The demand is higher than I ever imagined. You see, my family's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my cunning or my resources. It wasn't even failing to account for my decades of business experience. Their fatal error was assuming that being old meant being ready to die. I've spent my entire life building webs, networks of contacts, streams of income, safety nets, and backup plans. Some webs are meant to catch prey, others to catch falling victims. The strongest webs are the ones that look fragile but prove unbreakable when tested. My family walked into my web thinking they were the spiders, never realizing they were the flies. Age doesn't diminish cunning, it refines it. Experience doesn't cloud judgment, it sharpens it. And when someone tries to take everything you've worked for simply because they think you're too old to stop them, they learn a lesson that comes far too late. Never underestimate a spider who's been weaving webs longer than you've been alive. The young think they invented deception, but I perfected it before they drew their first breath. They assumed my silver hair meant a silver tongue had lost its edge, that my careful steps meant careful thoughts had slowed to a crawl. They were wrong. And now, as I sit in my web of evidence and justice, watching the news reports of their convictions, I can't help but smile. They wanted to inherit my legacy of success. Instead, they've inherited my legacy of consequences. In the end, the only thing they got from me was exactly what they deserved, nothing at all, except the knowledge that they'd been beaten by someone they thought was too old, too weak, and too trusting to fight back. Their first mistake was thinking I wouldn't notice their schemes. Their last mistake was thinking I wouldn't survive them. Between the first and the last, they learned what every predator eventually discovers. Sometimes the prey is more dangerous than the hunter. And sometimes, the spider at the center of the web is not the victim, but the architect of everyone else's downfall.